And now on the line is Paul O'Brien. Paul is the CEO of Plan Ireland. Paul, welcome back to the RFM.
Thank you, Darren.
Paul, I got in touch with you to do this interview today to focus on your work in Plan International on the issue of child marriage, and I know that you have a Christmas campaign on the issue at the moment. Today will be my first radio interview solely on the issue of child marriage. Paul, this is a big question, but can you tell me how big of an issue the issue of child marriage is in the countries in which Plan works? And can you tell me a bit about the interest you have in the issue?
Well, let's be clear, Darren. What we're talking about is marriage before the age of 18. Like the United Nations and most countries to consider a child to be a person under the age of 18. So we're talking about particularly girls getting married, sometimes being forced to get married before the age of 18. So how big a problem is it is? Well, about 1 in 5 young women and girls around the world actually are married by the age of 18. That gives us about, forgive the statistics, but it's about 650 million girls and women today were married before the age of 18, or what we would consider married as children. That works out at about 12 million each year, or as we put it, 1 every 2 seconds. And so, Darren, if you and I, if we have this interview, if it's 10 minutes long, around 300 children will be married during that time. That's how big an issue it is. It's absolutely huge. And it's something that we think, as a child's rights organization, it needs to be challenged, and particularly for girls, because it has a massive impact on their future.
Okay, are there any particular countries, Paul, in which this practice of child marriage is more common than others? And does it happen more in kind of remote areas, or what's the story?
There's countries like Niger and Chad and the Central African Republic where over 70%, 60 to 70% of girls under the age of 18 are married. Recently, I think we talked about Somalia, and while I was in Somalia, I learned that 45% or almost 50% of girls under the age of 18 were married there. And as I say, that has kind of a huge impact on their futures, because in many cases they're being pulled out of school, so they're not finishing their education. But also physically, if you want to say from a physical development point of view, their bodies are not sufficiently developed. And in many cases, what we have seen is a lot of complications in childbirth and in pregnancy because the girl is so young, having got married so young, and is now having children so young. So we say, it's children having children, or children being pregnant. So it's actually a huge mental, but it's a huge physical, and it has a huge physical toll, particularly on women.
Is it kind of like the issue of FGM in a sense that there's a few countries where it's very common, or is it more common than FGM in that it is extremely common in a lot of places?
I think it's like, I suppose sub-Saharan Africa is the place that we would be focusing on the most. So that's the countries south of the Sahara. But let's be clear, we can actually make a huge amount of progress on this issue when we start dealing with it. So in South Asia, for example, in the last 10 years, the prevalence of child marriage has been reduced from 50% down to 30% in 10 years. So there are very concrete steps that you can take to prevent it. And that's what we really try and focus on. And there's a number of those steps, Darren, that I can talk about. The most basic for us is actually educating girls and keeping girls in school. And that's a big thing for Plan Ireland that we do. We try and make sure that we maintain both girls and boys in school as long as they possibly can, certainly over the age of 18. But other sorts of things that you can look at and doing is around the law. Like in the last few years in Malawi, for example, it was legal for somebody of the age of 18 to get married. And we, together with a number of other agencies, lobbied the government and said, listen, you're basically allowing children to get married. You should change this in your constitution, in your law. And they did. And I think that's a huge sort of step for countries to take. So sometimes it can be there in practice, in traditional practice. Sometimes it's been done out of a necessity, particularly for poverty, or where families are really struggling to have enough income to buy enough food, that they will actually marry their daughters off and maybe get a dowry or something like that. But if you can get it in the law, then you have in many ways the instruments, or the tools to be able to kind of go about preventing it in a stronger way. You can focus on even getting birth certificates registered, so that girls have those and maybe have them in their hands, and so that they know their own rights themselves. So if their family members are proposing that they get married before 18, they can actually be empowered to push back against that and say, listen, it's illegal for me to do this in the country. You can't do this to me until I'm 18 or older. So there's so many different things that we have been doing, engaging with parents, engaging with the communities, and trying to say, listen, look at the impact of doing this. It tends also, to be honest, to breed kind of a lot of domestic violence as well, where younger girls are married, where the husband is a lot older. And we look at seeing, can we talk to, sometimes religious leaders, sometimes chief community leaders, and saying, listen, the dangers of allowing this practice to continue is that you get a whole host of teenage pregnancies. You'll get kind of this perpetual cycle, and really trying to value girls getting an education and how much better they can do once they have that schooling and education and that as well. And the final thing I would say that we actually try and do is, if we come across it that, girls have dropped out of school and they have got married and they have got children, you can still try and encourage to get them back into school. And even, again, we would work on the laws of the countries. There were some countries which prevented a girl with a child, or a girl who is pregnant, from going to school. And we pushed back against that and said, this is just so unfair to these girls through no fault of their own, and that the law shouldn't prevent them from getting an education. And again, we've been able to get girls, even who have been married, to get back into school to further their education.
Okay, I won't keep you much longer, Paul. I did an interview with you over a year ago at the height of the COVID pandemic, and you talked about the three C's: conflict, COVID, and climate change, and the impact it was having on developing countries in particular, like in sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know about the countries in which plan works, but am I right in saying that because of the impact of the three C's, particularly in the last couple of years, the issue of child marriage has actually got worse in some places because parents are kind of selling their daughters off to people? In some places it's got worse, like, has it?
Unfortunately, that is true, Darren. We've seen that in certain countries. And let me be very clear. I think sometimes parents are absolutely caught in a dilemma where they don't have an income in the home. Something may have happened. They may have had cattle or sheep and they may have died. And so the family is kind of destitute, and they may have a number of sons and a number of daughters. And what we've seen, is there's a tendency to marry girls off, in most cases before they're 18, in order for somebody else to be left to take care of them. And that's coming out of destitution. Honestly, Darren, we have seen some desperate stories coming out of Afghanistan recently, where we have seen and talked to parents who have basically been feeding their children drugs to try and help them to sleep. They have sold some of their own organs in order to repay debt and in order to buy food for their families. And they have sold their young children. And in some cases, I've seen it reported on the BBC, children, girls 2 years old, being sold into marriage for the future. So when she reaches the age of 14, she will go to another man's home. And that's happening at the moment in a place like Afghanistan. So those three C's, particularly the conflict and the climate change, The COVID, as we've seen in this country, has kind of died down a certain amount, but it did, if you want to say, dilute a lot of the development gains that had been made really over the last sort of 20, 25 years. We have seen those diluted in many countries and communities falling back into further destitution who had been making a lot of progress. So it's still very much there. It's not sort of being reported on maybe as much in the mainstream media, but it's actually in some communities it has got a lot worse, unfortunately.
Okay, it's great talking to you today, Paul. You're very informative on this issue. This, as I said to you at the start of the interview, this is my first interview, solely radio interview, solely on the issue of child marriage. Okay, you have a Christmas appeal in Plan International on the issue of child marriage. Can you tell me, Paul, what you Plan Ireland are calling on the Irish public to do?
Well, I suppose there's a number of things. We have a petition which people can see on our website at www.plan.ie, and we're encouraging people to sign the petition. Just saying that we don't agree with child marriage. Please end this practice. And we also kind of have at this time, because I suppose it's Christmas, that we have an appeal out that we're asking for funds, which will allow us to continue to run these programs that I've mentioned, particularly trying to keep girls in school, trying to ensure that they will get a quality education, trying to ensure maybe that we can support their families when they come under a lot of pressure so that they don't feel forced to encourage or sell their girls into marriage, so that we can keep those families going so that they can value their daughters just as much as they value their sons. And I suppose, yeah, we're looking for money. It's Christmas, so we're looking for money to try and support those programs directly, Darren.